Hi everyone, and welcome to another Frontrunners session. Today we're fortunate enough to have Sian Wingate with us, a legal expert who's formed a company called Tradie Terms. Sian's got extensive background working with utilities around liability and risk, and she's built up a real cachet of expertise and is now helping tradies get their act together, really, or get their terms of trade in line and work out where the lines of liability and risk are blurred and where they're very clear, and how that relates to their business. So I want to give a big welcome to Sian. Sian, welcome today, and thanks for being part of Frontrunners, and we're excited to hear about your new company and the innovation you're bringing to the market. So welcome, and what have you got for us today?
Thanks very much, Andrew, and it's a real pleasure and a privilege to be here, so thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome.
So today I'm going to share some tips for tradie business owners for planning their works around underground services, with an emphasis on contracting clarity. So some of the things that typically a trade business owner might not think about doing before they get on site and work in or around underground services. Okay, so who's going to be interested in learning from us here at Tradie Terms today? Well, you might be a small independent trades business owner. You might be an owner operator of, say, an excavation or a groundworks or demolition company. You might work in the fencing sector doing fencing. You might be a concreter. You might work as, say, a directional drilling company. You might work on subdivisions. So basically, you're going to be a trades business owner that works around underground services, either because you're breaking ground or because you're working on ground that's already been opened up, say in an open trench, by somebody else. So one of the things we're going to focus on today is where the link comes between the 5 safety practices that beforeUdig are very passionate about promoting, and how that links in to getting your contract sorted, getting your terms of trade sorted, and getting your scope sorted. So before we kind of dive into my kind of 3 top tips, I just thought it would be really helpful for those of you watching just to get a wee reminder of those 5 safety practices, because I'm going to talk about those 5 Ps quite a lot as we go through this short talk today. So these are pulled off the beforeUdig website, and if you're not familiar with where to locate these, you can just go to their safety practices tab, and they've got this nice and clearly set out. So we reminder that you will be responsible as a trade business owner for planning ahead before you break ground. We expect you to prepare by reviewing those plans. We need you to be potholing to make sure you establish the exact location of all of those underground utilities, because of course things move, things shift, especially in the shaky isles here in New Zealand. We want to make sure that you're taking those protective measures to make sure you're communicating to the others on site, putting barriers in place, etc., using warning tape, and then you're ready to proceed. So you might think, well, you know, what's this got to do with contracting or scopes of work? And that's what we're going to dive into today.
Yeah, nice.
So the top 3 mistakes. Now, there's 3 mistakes that in my experience I've seen happen over and over again with not just small independent trades businesses, but large companies as well, but especially with the smaller owner operators like yourselves that might be watching. And those 3 mistakes that we see happen most frequently are, number 1, there's a poor on-site process, which means there's some blurred lines between the owner-operator trades business and maybe a larger head contractor about who's going to manage those locates on site. Mistake number 2 is a kind of she'll be right attitude, and that's the sort of hope that if you do some of those 5 Ps, maybe not all, but just some, that, you know, that's going to be enough to get you off the hook if line damage or strikes do happen. And then number 3 is a big mistake that we see a lot, which is you think you can pass the risk to your client. And this comes in the form of unfair contract terms, where you try and put in your contract or your T's and C's that all the liability passes over to your client. So we're going to dig a little deeper into these 3 mistakes as we go along. And I guess just before I do that, Andrew, have you had experience of seeing these occur in your line of work?
Yeah, yes, certainly. I mean, we hear about strikes every day. I was actually talking to a family member last night, and it was my mum actually, and I was telling her about the incredible amount of strikes on networks in New Zealand. And what I like about what you're sharing is you're actually crystallizing for the contractor where their responsibility lies. And accountability is so closely linked with that responsibility. So you don't want to assume that you've taken responsibility and missed things and then be accountable financially. And if someone's been harmed seriously, or there's been a death, well, we don't have industrial manslaughter in New Zealand, but that could also be extremely difficult to navigate in the courts. So we've seen instances of WorkSafe prosecuting people, not lots of them, but there are instances. There was a death in, I think, Papakura, of a gentleman on a scooter who fell off the scooter, hit his head and died. So, you know, that contractor, he didn't take responsibility, and he didn't do the right thing. Poor on-site practices, and the court ruled that was negligent. So, you know, there are instances where people are being prosecuted, but I think we're not talking about just a tick box to avoid prosecution. Although that's important, we're talking about how do we keep ourselves, our workmates, the community safe on site.
Absolutely.
So there's loads of examples, Sian, and I'm sure you probably know more than I do.
Many,
Yeah,
we got our fair share of war stories that we could share. We could even do a whole session just on war stories. And definitely that's the focus today, is to kind of give some really practical how-tos to avoid these mistakes and the impacts that they cause. So why don't we dive into that mistake number 1. So before I do that, I'll just kind of repeat a little bit more about who I am and kind of why I know really what we're talking about here and why I've got the experience that I have. So as Andrew mentioned, I'm Sian Wingate, and I founded Tradie Terms just over a year ago. And it's off the back of working as a lawyer right inside civil infrastructure, utilities and telco companies. So when I say inside, I was the lawyer working for those companies. So I looked at all those scopes of work, wrote all those contracts, and dealt with all of the consequences of when line strikes happened, when we were using subcontractors and so on. And now I kind of focus on terms of trade and how they actually really link in to those 5 Ps and your scope of work. And I'm really passionate about educating small owner operators, because the little guy doesn't have access to a lot of the work and knowledge that those big companies have when they've got a lawyer like I was working for them every day. So this is my way of just sharing some of those insights for the smaller owner operators out there. So let's look at mistake number 1. So Andrew, what we see usually as the precursor to any of the damage claims or damage strikes that you know sadly can happen is that there's been a poor on-site process and a blurring of the lines of responsibility on site before the ground's even been broken. And what I mean by this is, you know, like all trades, you are supposed to have a really robust health and safety plan in place. And you might have a health and safety management plan, and typically that might include your toolbox meeting and various steps to kind of check off before you get on site. But sometimes the part around the 5 Ps is missed. And the reason it's missed by the smaller owner operators is because there's some assumptions made that because maybe they're subcontracting to a larger contractor who might in turn be the service partner, say to a utility or a local council, is that the smaller subcontractor thinks that somebody else has dealt with all of those 5 Ps and that all they need to do is turn up on site and get the job done. And that's a mistake. And the reason that's a mistake is because actually the blurred lines don't get you off the hook. So I'll just explain that by this slide here. So what do I mean by the blurred lines and being on the hook? So I call it the duty of care confusion. And the example I'm going to use is where utility work's being done. So let's imagine you're an owner operator, you do directional drilling, or you're going to go and do some installation of ducts in an open service trench, say, for a developer. And you're the subcontractor that's going to come in and maybe do a small portion of the work. Often you might be confused as part of your health and safety planning about who's got the duty of care. So who's responsible at law for performing all of those 5 Ps? And my response is you share the care. So if you have a look at this diagram here, you might have the principal on the left-hand side. So that might be the utility owner, could be a council that owns the water mains, let's say. Then you might have their service partner, one of the big civil contracting companies that do all the council's work when there's repairs or maintenance or new installations to be done. And then there's you, and you're brought in by that service partner just as and when you're needed. You might think mistakenly that because there's these 2 other bigger parties involved, that actually you're off the hook because they're there, they're on site, they've got the bigger health and safety management plans. They might even have, you know, nominated health and safety personnel that come on site and do all the checks and balances. But unfortunately, the law doesn't see it that way. The law says you're the one on site, you're also the one breaking ground, you're also the one working with your directional drill, for example, or your excavator or your digger bucket. You're also the one working around those underground services. So you share the care and you share it equally. And that's probably the biggest myth that I really want to bust in this first learning point, is that if you're confused, hopefully you've got a bit of clarity now, that you share the care equally. You're all on the same level playing field. And I think that's one thing just to really think about when you are looking at any of your service contracts or your quotes, that you're really clear who is in charge of that health and safety management plan. And we'll kind of circle back to a checklist at the end of my chat, just to remind you of what we mean by putting on some of those checks and balances in place.
So Sian, that relates directly to the law around the Health and Safety at Work Act with the PCBU, doesn't it? And your service partner and you as the minor contractor are both the PCBU, aren't
Correct.
you? Yes.
Yeah. And so is the principal. So even the utility that owns the asset, the chain goes all the way down. So so the point there is around your health and safety plans should always assume that you need to be involved very closely in either performing the 5 Ps or at least checking and making sure you've got to check that they have been performed before you even get into your digger cab or start up your machinery.
So Sian, why is that blurred for a lot of smaller contractors? Is it just that they switch off, they don't want to know about it, they focus on their work, or it's not a priority for them, or they just don't feel, well, look, there's bigger players in this game, I'm not going to be accountable here?
You know, Andrew, I think it's a mixture of all 3, plus a big dollop of a general lack of awareness about the health and safety laws in New Zealand. And so, you know, you're always going to get the contractors who want to just turn up, do the work and leave. And because there's bigger players involved, they almost want the bigger players to take all that responsibility of the health and safety planning because it's easier and it's a little bit more comfortable. And it's cheaper, you know, that's another factor, as the smaller players don't always have that resource to do all that planning. And it can be a bit confronting as well. You know, you think if you're on site with a bigger service partner that actually you sort of have to be a bit deferential. You know, you have to say, oh, you know, well, you let us know what to do and we'll fall in line. And then I think just also a general lack of awareness about how the chain of command actually follows you all the way down to the last guy on the site. And, you know, WorkSafe do some great work to try and promote and explain your obligations on site. And so does beforeUdig. The resources on your website, one thing I probably haven't mentioned to you before is that in all of my kind of decade working for electricity distribution companies and telecommunications, that beforeUdig website was always on my favourites bar, and we referred to it constantly in our internal training because it is a fantastic source of information and it's all extremely accurate. So, you know, if a contractor doesn't know where to find out this information, they can just go to your website. They don't have to go and find a lawyer. They can find out from your website nice and easily.
Awesome, Sian.
So let's just dive into maybe mistake number 2 now. So we call this the she'll be right mate. Have you heard this expression?
Once or twice.
Yeah. And you can tell from my accent, everybody, that I'm not native to New Zealand. I'm from the UK originally, and my husband is Taranaki born and bred, so brought me over just over 10 years ago. And I walked straight into the she'll be right mate environment and attitude, and it is live and kicking still. And from working in a background of telecommunications, but also electricity distribution, where there's lots of live power lines, either ahead, over the ground or under the ground, the she'll be right mate approach is dangerous. There's no other way to describe it. It is dangerous in terms of safety, because people can actually be, you know, severely injured or even die from, you know, line strikes. But I also want to just frame up that it's also dangerous from a business health and safety. And what I mean by that is that your business needs to be able to survive. And if you have a big financial, you know, risk that comes up with repair costs because you've not done your 5 Ps, then you're putting your business health at risk as well as your personnel. So in sort of, you know, the first part, we talked about health and safety. I want to kind of focus here on the health and safety of your business as well. So what we mean by the she'll be right mate is, I'm still going to come back to this kind of concept of that confusion about the duty of care. And I thought here we'll move to a different example, which is where you might be a small owner operator trades business that works with residential customers. So you might be helping people get ready to do an infill for a subdivision. You might be putting in a new driveway. You might be pulling ground to put in a new fence. Whatever you're doing, you might be laying a concrete slab. Whatever you're doing, you might be working for a residential homeowner. And a lot of independent trades are equally confused, if not more confused, that we've discovered, around their duty of care to perform those 5 Ps when it comes to working with owners, homeowners. And the reason for that is they think, well, you know, we might have said to the homeowner that they need to go ahead and organise the beforeUdig plans and lodge the application online. They might say the homeowner needs to get the cable locator to come out and do the spray and do the markings. And then they might say, you know, we'll come on site and we'll just get ready to do the work. What we just want to sort of clear up here, if there's any confusion, is that even if you've gotten the homeowner to be involved in some of those 5 Ps, the law says, and this is sort of that negligence point that you talked about, negligence is when you haven't done everything you could have done to avoid damage or injury. That's all that negligence means. You've not done enough. And what the law says is, you as the operator of that business should know what enough is. You've got enough information, especially in the public, you know, domain. So what we mean by that is there's plenty of stuff online. There's plenty of info that you can get from a website like beforeUdig that's going to be super clear what your 5 Ps are. What's the sequence of safety measures and checks you should be performing to avoid causing damage to property or injury to people. And what the law says in a nutshell is you're the expert. You know, your residential customer is paying you to come and do that work. So they expect you as part of your skills and knowledge to know how to avoid damaging underground services. So the confusion often lies in independent trades thinking, oh, well, we've told the owner to get that sorted. All we need to do is turn up and actually do the work. We don't need to do anything else. And I just want to clarify that, you know, if it got as far as a kind of claim or an insurance claim or a disputes tribunal claim and all these other places where these can end up, they will always point the finger back to you, as will WorkSafe, which is all the care is on you. You're the expert. So that's a really probably confronting learning point, because some trades especially tradies that we work with, say, no, that's not right. It's on them. We sort of have to politely explain, no, it's on you. So let's just make sure you know what you need to be doing and how you need to be protecting yourself.
Sian, I suppose from our point of view, this is a very tricky area too, because often utilities don't provide plans for their assets or their assets on private property.
Mm-hmm.
And so it involves the contractor who's working for the homeowner to take further steps. So this is where location of services becomes very important. And you know, I've heard so many stories of drain layers and fences hitting power cables, hitting telcos, hitting infrastructure, because the utility doesn't provide plans for private property, and they haven't accurately located where those assets are. So some of this duty of care is further complicated with cost and trying to win work. Yeah. So whether you're working for a contracting company or the homeowner, there's always those cost pressures. Yeah. And you know, I'm sure your advice would be, it's just not worth compromising on cost when you're sacrificing your health and safety and due diligence.
And I think there's a bit of a balance that you need to try and strike as the trades business owner. And so, yes, you're going to try and compete on price, but you can also try and wrap up some of these extra actions in your cost, as long as you're super clear about what the different stages of your job preparation is. You know, most tradies will know that the majority of work happens way before they actually get on site. There's so much planning that's involved often before you get to site. There's the scoping work and the planning, and this is part of that scoping work. And so there's definitely things that tradies can do to share the load. So we're not saying here that they can't share the load with a homeowner and say, hey, could you order some plans? And if the plans come back and say, actually, there's no locations because it's on private property and the utility doesn't have a record of what's inside the boundary, then the next step would be, okay, if you've not got any plans and there's no cable locates, we need to get an actual physical locator out, and they'll use their equipment and they'll do their mark out. And then it's going to take us a little bit longer to prep the site because we're going to have to come and do some hand digging and some potholing. And so what we say to our tradies is, people will not necessarily be too concerned always about price, as long as they know what the process is and why the price reflects that. And sometimes if you're going to be on site anyway in advance, this is just including these activities when you're on site. And so it's just part of those initial site visits, is there could be some potholing done or some cable locates, so they can meet the cable locator. So we're not saying it's impossible or that it's not a bit of a balance, you know, between cost and effort. What we are saying, though, is that if you sort of skip those steps, then the law doesn't really, sadly, the law doesn't look beyond the sort of price and say, well, or we can see it wasn't really economic for you to include that in your pre-work. It will just say, you're the expert, you shouldn't have dug that hole there until you knew there was no services beneath it. You know, the law's a bit black and white sometimes, sadly. And so the best thing to do is to just include it as part of your scope, and always include it as, you can always explain it as being part of your health and safety. And at the end of the day, a homeowner doesn't want you to cause damage because it's going to delay their work. It's going to have a hold up. There's going to be insurance companies involved. There's going to be utilities driving out to then repair. And, you know, I've seen the impact of that so many times, is sort of poor homeowners, if you like, end up with their projects just, you know, dragging on, because then there's, you know, the gas company, the power company and the council all there on site trying to organise their repairs, and they just hold everybody up.
That's right.
Yeah. So I just thought then we'll talk about mistake number 3, and that really is kind of linking on from mistake number 2, and it's the risk factor here of who's got the risk of the costs of repairs if the worst happens, if somebody else's utility assets are damaged. when you, the tradie, is performing the work. And we see a lot of tradies have a DIY go at their terms of trade and what they kind of put in their quotes as kind of inclusions and exclusions. And when we look at those, one of the first things we do if we know that they're working around underground services is we check to see if they're trying to say to the client, whether it's a big, utility company, whether it's a head contractor, or whether it's a homeowner, we check to see if they're trying to put in some wording to say, hey, if we do damage any cables or assets, then you're fully liable, or they might use words like, you will indemnify us, which is basically an IOU, which is basically you trying to say to your client, if we stuff up and hit something, you've got to pay back, or you've got to pay the money to get it fixed. We're off the hook. And sadly, that rarely works. And there's a couple of reasons why, and I'll focus on one of those reasons. And this, again, is my example here is about residential clients. So that example you gave earlier, Andrew, about, it is tricky if the utilities don't have plans that show where their assets might be inside a boundary. And that's because often the assets, when they're inside a private property boundary, are no longer, sometimes they're not even owned by the utility at that point. They're what we call a service line, and sometimes they're owned by the homeowner. Again, a lot of homeowners don't even know that. So when I worked with power companies, they had no idea that the underground cables or the overhead cables, once they went into their boundary, were actually theirs. And that's a whole other story, especially if you've got, damage that happens to them. But what the law says is if you're working with a residential customer, you've got to make sure as a business, so remember that every trade operator is a business. Even if they're a sole trader and not a company, they're still a business. So what the law says is you're the business and your residential customer is not. And so they're kind of a bit of the underdog. And the law says, they can't be expected to know what all these contract terms mean. So the law protects them, and it wraps this kind of big protection bubble around them under consumer law. And it says, you've got to make sure, tradie, that your contract terms are fair. And if they're not fair, the law says that contract term won't apply. And that's because, Joe Bloggs that lives on number 1 Joe Bloggs Street doesn't know all the rules and regulations about making sure that the 5 Ps are followed. They don't know about health and safety law. They don't even know anything half the time about utility assets and that there's even anything under the ground on their property. So what we're saying here is if you're a tradie and you've got your terms of trade and you've pulled together your quote and you've popped in your quote something like you'll indemnify us or you'll reimburse us if we hit any underground cables and it's your full responsibility. Unfortunately, the law will not agree to that. So you can write it down as much as you want, but the law, if somebody actually had a claim and you had a line strike, the law would just say, or the insurer would just say, well, that doesn't apply. Sorry, you're still on the hook. You still got to pay the money. So my kind of learning point here is, as a trade business owner, you need to allocate your risk fairly if you're working with residential clients. And sadly, those words on a page just mean nothing if the law says that they're not fair. So there's kind of like a bit of a...
Sorry to interrupt. So the lesson here is don't kid yourself. Live in reality. You can't wish it how you would like it to be. You have to live in the reality of how it is.
Yeah.
And your contract should reflect that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we know that a lot of tradies don't even have contracts. They don't have terms of trade. They might just work on sending a quote out. And even your quote can be used against you if you try to put in your quote, in the words, before your price to say, the price excludes any underground service locations. That's the full responsibility of the homeowner. Even if you've put those words in, the law will still, or the insurance company, because it's usually insurance companies that are involved in these pricing, just sort of the battles to pay. They'll just say, well, we know that's not applicable, so you're still on the hook for 100%. Thank you very much. And the homeowner, is never going to be on the hook So that's it doesn't feel fair if you're a small owner operator, and we know that sometimes the law just doesn't feel fair. But what the law's doing is it's trying to protect those consumers that just are never going to know any better, because they're not living and breathing this type of work all day, every day, like you are if you're used to breaking ground and doing excavation or working around underground services. So Andrew, I thought we'll just do a bit of a kind of wrap up with a checklist about those kind of 3 mistakes and what, you know, our small or medium business owner operators can do to try and avoid making those mistakes and being on the hook for those repair costs or those headaches, those, you know, damage to reputation, the time and effort to sort out those claims. And also, we just don't want them to be damaging underground services. It's really disruptive to everybody and it's costly. So here's 5 kind of checkpoints that you can follow if you're a small business owner. So number 1 is please include those 5 Ps as part of your own health and safety plan. Don't think that they always have to be part of someone else's. Include them as part of your own health and safety plan and part of your own toolbox and site checklists before you break ground. Number 2, we really recommend that you agree in advance in your scope of work who is going to perform those 5 Ps. So if you're working with a utility or another head contractor, ask the question, don't make any assumptions, and agree. And if they're going to do all 5 Ps, that's great. At least you know, and at least you can then check as part of your health and safety plan that they have actually been carried out before you do your part of the work. Number 3, which is kind of repeating but really important, is just don't make any assumptions. That should kind of be part of your, almost like every checklist you've got. Don't assume. And if in doubt and you don't know, even if you've agreed with your head contractor that they will perform, or even your homeowner, if they'll perform some of the 5 Ps, don't assume they've done it or that they know how to do it properly. Check, and if in doubt and you've got a niggle and you feel like it hasn't been done, re-perform them. Number 4, we really recommend you check your residential terms of trade. So what we mean by that is your terms of trade for doing those pieces of work with residential homeowners. Check they're not unfair. Check you haven't got those words in there that try and say that they're on the hook. And number 5, be clear and upfront with your residential clients on what they should arrange. Excuse me.
We're demanding, aren't we? We're requiring a lot of you today, Sian.
And number 5, just be clear and upfront with your residential clients, especially, on what you want them to arrange in advance. It's great to save time. It's great to get them to do some of the checks and balances if they can get plans. And if they can't, be really clear and upfront what you're going to do if they can't arrange that themselves in advance. So we know that seems like a lot, but those 5 things will really help you to avoid making those 3 mistakes that we see all too often.
Sian, we're actually really lucky to have you working here with tradies in New Zealand, and I would recommend every tradie. And I've had friends who started businesses, 20 years ago and were very comprehensive with some of their contracts and got lawyers to check their contracts. And I think you'd be wise as a tradie to engage tradie terms to assist you to make sure that you are doing your due diligence and also that your contracts reflect fairly and cover you as the contractor, but also, the homeowner. So we're really lucky to have your expertise because you've got such a broad experience working with utilities and you've been on the other side of the fence. I mean, utilities have their own networks, they own them, they put them in the ground at their cost. Contractors come along and they're digging around it. And unfortunately, all of the responsibility rests with the contractor. So it's so important that everybody takes responsibility. Not just to comply to the law, but, also to comply to the law, but to look after themselves, the community and their workers on site, and the infrastructure for everybody to enjoy and use. So, Sian, in terms of the elevator pitch for your business, Tradie Terms. Tell us just in a nutshell, why would I as a contractor need to come and see you, and what value would you bring to my business as a tradie?
That's a great question, and thank you for asking that. So if somebody wanted to learn more about what we do, there's a few ways they can get in touch with us. We've got a Facebook page. We're on Instagram where we share tips and lots of live videos. We've got a YouTube channel where we're adding videos all the time to share some of these tidbits and top tips and more. And we've got our website. But what is it we do, and why would a contractor or small business owner want to work with us? Well, one of the first things we do is we help contractors and small business owners get their quotes simplified. And what we mean by that is having the right information in those quotes and those scopes of work to make it really clear what they're going to do, what they're not going to do, and what the customer needs to do or the client needs to do in advance, because that's the best place to put that information. We also make sure, which is kind of outside the topic we're talking about today, but we make sure they set smart payment terms. So if they're doing work, say that's going to be complex and staged over many weeks or months, that they know how to break down those payments to get payment early and frequent. Deposits, progress payments, that type of thing, to make sure that the cash is coming into their business and they're staying nice and cash positive, because most trades businesses will fail in the first 3 years because they just don't have enough money.
I think a lot of tradies' ears just pricked up at that point there, Sian.
And a great kind of quick segue to sort of share is that, during this sort of the recording of this was when we've been in lockdown here in New Zealand, and I checked in with some of my sort of clients that I'd worked with, and several of the ones I checked in with were landscapers and excavators and demolition companies. And I said, how are you getting on? Are you okay with the fact that you can, stop work during level 4? And they said, you know what? We're all up to date with our invoices. We applied all the payment terms that you've suggested all the way through the last year. We've got plenty of cash at bank. We're fine. We're not worried at all. And that just made my day, because they sort of got that package together to make sure that they were asking for payment frequently enough, and that their quotes were nice and simple so people could understand when they were going to ask for payment. So that's kind of the main thing that we help contractors with. But if you watch this today,
trade is a key one, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And it's sort of why I've saved the best till last, if you like, which is we talked today about, where things might be in terms of trade that are not going to be reliable because they're unfair, or that there's maybe nothing in there at all about who's responsible for what if things do go wrong. And so one of the things we do is make sure that there are solid terms of trade in place. So if you're a small business owner and you don't have any, you can get some from us and they'll be tailored for you if you're a landscaper or a ground excavator. If you've got them in place and you need them to be tweaked, we can have a look at them and either help you update them or replace them with ours, which are comprehensive. So we focus just on small trades business owners. We don't work with big companies. They've got plenty of, resource themselves. Often they've got their own in-house lawyers. So we're helping the smaller guys.
Awesome, Sian. Very satisfying, I'm sure.
Thank you. Oh, it is. It's I absolutely love it. I'm the daughter of a panel beater, so I've seen, firsthand sort of how much work goes in behind the scenes for those small businesses.
Yes.
Watching my dad work through that. So what we've done today is, because we know everybody likes a bit of free, that everyone wants to sort of get a freebie and also, find out a bit more, is we've pulled together a checklist. So we've got a free guide, which is in the form of a downloadable PDF. And this is available to anyone that's been watching today. And you can share this information with any other trade business you know or want to share it with. And it's a free checklist for how you need to check your scope and your contracts are clear if you are a trade business owner working around underground services. And we've made it super simple. All you have to do is email us to info@tradieterms.com and just put the word checklist. You don't have to say anything else if you don't want to. Just put the word checklist in the email somewhere, or in the email header, and we'll send that free guide over to you, so you can kind of learn a bit more about what we talked about today in your own time.
Great, Sian. Thank you so much for today. I'm sure you're going to get lots of people emailing you, requesting the contracting checklist. What we're going to do is we're going to boil down this Front Runners series and probably slice and dice it a little bit, but also have the full session available to tradies, because I think this is the sort of thing every tradie needs to listen to and have knowledge around. So once again, thanks, Sian, so much, and we look forward to working with you in the future and hearing more about your successes.
Oh, thank you so much, Andrew. It's been an absolute pleasure. And like I said at the beginning, we're a really proud supporter of beforeUdig. What you guys are doing is so essential, and the information you provide is so useful. So if anybody ever wants to know more, all they need to do is go onto your website, and you know, I'm the expert, and I'm the one that uses it all the time.
Thanks for your support, Sian.
Thanks, Andrew.